This episode is brought to you by Hyperice, the leader in advanced warm-up and recovery technology. They have tons of innovative products, like Venom-heated wearables to help soothe sore back muscles, Normatec compression boots to speed up recovery and increase circulation, and Hypervolt massage guns to improve mobility. Loved by athletes like Naomi Osaka and Erling Haaland. Try them yourself. Get 10% off your order with the code MOVE at hyperice.com.
Hello and welcome to the Publicly Challenged Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Oswald, and I hope you join me on my quest for knowledge to become a better public land hunter, angler, and forager. Stick with this and who knows, maybe we will learn something together. All right, real quick before we get started on the show, I'm just going to talk about Treeline Academy. You've heard me say it. I can't even tell you how many times. Mark Livesey is treelineacademy.net. That's treelineacademy.net. Sign up. Use the promo code PC2020. Save yourself $20. Can't say it enough. It's awesome. Amazing. Most comprehensive e-scouting course out there. Check it out for yourself. Sign up. Use promo code PC2020. And now let's get to the show. All right, so I'm sitting here and I'm talking to ORION AON. And Orion, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, hey everyone. Like you said, my name's Orion. I live in Colorado, and the reason I'm on today is we're going to talk about foraging a little bit. I have a side business called Forage Colorado where I offer education, whether that's in person or through my social media and online, my website, all about foraging. I have been doing it for about 6.5 or 7 years, and I just am enamored with all things wild food, including hunting and fishing. But I think the main focus today will be foraging. I teach people about edible mushrooms and edible plants, and just I'm passionate about the whole world.
Nice. So I got to ask you, the whole foraging, hunting, fishing thing, was that something that was always part of your life, or you grew up with that as a childhood? I mean, you grew up in Arizona, right?
I grew up in New Mexico.
Oh, New Mexico. Okay. So
Yep.
You grew up in New Mexico. I mean, was that part of your life down there, or was that something that just kind of evolved over time?
Yeah. So the first kind of outdoor wild food pursuit that I started with was fishing. I don't remember it, but I remember the story of being bundled up and taken out ice fishing in New Mexico when I was 5, I think. And that's kind of, some of the first implanted memories that I have of being out and doing something in pursuit of wild food. And then every summer since I was born, we would go to Minnesota. My mom's side is from Minnesota. And so, Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. So
Yeah.
Fishing obviously was a big part of it there. And so every summer I would do fishing. And around age 10, we had a family friend who was into mushroom hunting, and they offered to take me and my brother and my dad out. And from then on, we sort of just made a mushroom hunting trip an annual thing, at least once, maybe 2 or 3 times some years. We would get out, go check our spots, spend the day picking mushrooms if they were out. And that sort of ingrained me with this like sense of, especially with mushrooms, it's like a treasure hunt. Like you're looking for this weird, fascinating stuff that you can eat in the woods. And I took that kind of knowledge when I moved to college. I moved to Fort Collins to attend Colorado State University for natural resource management. And I started adding trees and plants into my education. And then I started incorporating that into my foraging interest. And in 2015, I was kind of bothered with the lack of like places to share information and talk with other foragers and, just share in the passion essentially. And so I started Forage Colorado originally as a community where like-minded people could just talk about stuff. And it quickly evolved into me being the educator for other people as more of an education platform instead of a community platform. And I started taking people out for morel classes. A lot of people don't know morels grow in Colorado, but we actually have a pretty good number of morels. They're picking morels right now in the burn areas. It's end of July. So most people in the Midwest probably be surprised to hear that. But yeah, I know people that are picking pounds and pounds of morels out of the burn areas right now. And so I started teaching people that, and it just evolved into, me kind of offering education on this stuff that it seems like more and more people are interested nowadays.
So let's kind of rewind that a little bit, because you kind of said a lot with the whole, you started this community for other people and you end up being the educator. But at what point was it that you actually became the educator, and how did you educate yourself?
Yeah, so I was kind of looking for this stuff like 2014, 2015, starting Forage Colorado as a community. And I think in 2015 is really when it was like, okay, this is going to be me offering education instead of a community driven platform. And I already had from my schooling of natural resource management, and at that time, 12 or so years of mushroom hunting, I kind of had the foundation for picking up on learning this stuff really quickly. And plant identification and tree identification was something that I was schooled in, and so I was able to just sort of absorb as much as possible in a quick quick amount of time. And as I started sharing it, people were just very interested in what I had to talk about and wanted to learn more. And so that's kind of that transition was just like me absorbing stuff, and then as I learned it and felt really comfortable with it, sending it out to other people as I discovered new things, or just sharing something new that I learned with people. Sort of like a voice in the space of foraging that is sharing information.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So when you did your mushroom hunting, because I mean, like, what I find fascinating is there's a lot of mushroom hunters out there, a lot, but typically they only hunt maybe 2 or 3 different species or types of mushrooms, and that's it. They don't ever branch out or go any further from that. What was it that drove you to go further and find different species of mushrooms?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people. This is a big topic, so we'll see how far it goes. But I'm gonna sort of compare to like Midwest. In the Midwest, it's like morels in the spring, and then maybe like chicken of the woods and hen of the woods in the summer and fall. Chanterelles maybe, and the easy to learn ones, they're really really kind of foolproof to learn and identify. And that's the same in other states too. In Colorado we have king boletes and chanterelles and oyster mushrooms and a few others. But because I started so young in the world of mushrooms, it had always fascinated me and just like drew my interest. And so that's really in the whole world of foraging and trees and plants and mushrooms, the mushrooms are really my passion. And so on top of foraging for the edible species, I also do a little bit of like amateur mycology, where I'm offering identifications for people online and looking for cool species myself and documenting them. Not necessarily edible species, but inedible, toxic, unknown. Mycology is such a novel field that we're learning new stuff regularly, and so it's really fun to sort of see it just like expand and grow. And so that's sort of how I got into breaking out of the like 4 or 5 edible species that people are comfortable with. And I think I have around 40 different edible species I've eaten so far. And I keep track of them on a spreadsheet, and I'm like very, compared to some people, very cautious about eating new species. I research a lot. I make sure I'm 100% confident and comfortable before I eat one. And sometimes that takes 2 or 3 years of finding it, picking it, getting used to its features. And that's something that I teach in my classes. But on the other end, to talk to the side of the people that are kind of stuck in the 2 to 4 species or so, One, they're sort of like, that's all they taught, or that's all they were taught. And so that's sort of, they don't want to learn anything else. They know those. They're happy to go pick morels in the spring and those couple fall species, and that's that. And that's totally cool. But there's other people that, really get interested in like, oh, like I've heard about this cool species that's edible and I want to find it and try it and see what it tastes like, because each mushroom tastes a little differently. They can have different textures, different smells, different flavors. And so finding the ones that you like and trying new ones is sort of this like culinary experience that you would never get to experience anywhere else. And there's another aspect to that in North America that most people call mycophobia, which is fear of mushrooms. And so there's like this kind of underlying fear and taboo around mushrooms where, the general populace is sort of afraid of them. And so I think that can drive a little bit into people sticking to like the easy ones to learn. They're like, I know morels, I know oysters, I know chicken of the woods, everything else is deadly. I don't care about the other ones. And I see that a little bit online, and it's like, that's fine if that's what you want to do, but there's so much more interesting stuff, and there's really not that many deadly species out there, and it's pretty easy to differentiate them if you just put a little time into it. And so, that's how I approach it. I'm totally cool with the people that are just like, I know 3, I'm going to eat those the rest of my life. I don't care about the others. So
yeah, for sure. No, I don't know. For some reason, it fascinates me, and I wish I had more time to just get out there and spend out there, and even take my kids and find them and study them together, and try and figure out what they are. But it's tough sometimes. It's tough to get out there and do all that. But
yeah, I hear you.
It's always interesting to go, and like just recently I posted one and I tagged you in it because I was hoping you would see what it was and be able to identify it for me. But the same thing, I mean, you see it and you take a picture of it and you wanna, you wanna figure it out. Like I'm always looking now because I saw Adam Harrington posted the garlic mushroom. So any tiny little mushroom I see sporing off of like a dead twig somewhere, I'm always picking it up and studying it and trying to figure out, different what it is, right? And looking for that little elusive tiny little mushroom, but have yet to be successful on that.
Yeah, I found some of those Mycetinas. That's the genus of that garlic smelling mushroom. I found some of those in Minnesota this summer.
What'd you
for
do
the
with
first
them?
time? Just smell them and then put them back.
Okay. That's the other thing is I try and just take really good pictures now and identify them rather than disrupt the actual life cycle, because I mean everything has a purpose, right? And take what we need and do the rest. Although I get it. Some people say take it home. Say you're going to use what was the word? A mycoterrarium or something like that, to where you're actually studying them and putting them, growing them. I don't know, but
yeah. Well, the interesting thing about mushrooms is the actual mushroom that you see above ground is the fruiting body of the fungus. So the actual fungus is the mycelium that lives in the soil or the wood or the substrate that they're growing from. And so when the conditions suit it, they send up their fruit, which is the mushrooms. So picking them is comparable to picking a fruit off of a tree. If you take that apple off of an apple tree, you're not harming the apple tree, right? You're just taking some potential seeds, but mushrooms, instead of seeds, have spores. And as soon as they come out of the ground and start opening their cap, they're sending spores out. So there's a huge misinformation. People still online. There's 2 giant debates on mushrooms. It's cutting versus picking. The synopsis of that is it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And long-term studies have actually shown that picking is slightly more beneficial to the actual fungus because it doesn't allow bacteria and other infections to get in through the cut surface. And the other debate is picking all the mushrooms or leaving a certain number or letting some go to spore or carrying them in a basket so that they can spread spores. And at the end of the day, if you're comparing it to a fruit, which is what it is, even if you harvest all of them from an area, one, it'll probably fruit again. If conditions are suiting it to fruit, it'll keep sending more fruit out. Unlike a tree that sort of flowers and fruits all at the same time, the mushrooms can continue to fruit until the conditions don't suit it. So that's one thing. The other thing is, unlike a fruit, they're dropping spores constantly as soon as they've reached a mature stage, versus a fruit which matures, dies, and then either an animal eats it or it drops its seeds directly and then has the potential to become a new tree. The mushrooms are consistently sending out their quote unquote seeds to create new colonies of mycelium. So picking it doesn't harm the mycelium, and it doesn't affect future generations because the mycelium is still in the soil. Additionally, it's sending spores out consistently. So, unless you're there every day picking every little tiny mushroom, you're not going to affect it.
Awesome. I like
and
that.
The other thing is, people are like, leave some for wildlife, but that's fine. But the wildlife live there. Like, they eat those things as much as they want. We could never beat them to them. So it's kind of a moot argument. But at the end of the day, you should do what you're comfortable with and what you feel is respectful to the resource, and your own morals and philosophical feelings about this topic. It should be what you practice. Don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. But the science says and supports what I just went over, essentially.
I like that. Let's rewind it a little bit, though. You said the picking versus cutting, and cutting actually leaves it exposed to different bacteria and stuff. Now, have they found that exposed, the root or whatever you want to call it of the mushroom exposed actually causes enough bacteria to where it can like kill the actual mycelium underground? Or
so I don't think so. There's a couple long-term studies. There's one that was done for about a decade, and another one that's still ongoing, that's been going for about 30 years. And what they did is they have different plots, and they have plots where they cut, plots where they pick, and plots where they leave it alone. They don't touch anything, the control plot. And over time, each of the plots were statistically similar versus cutting, picking, and leaving them alone. There was like a slight positive on the picked side because of those cut stems. And I don't know that they went into like the actual damage towards the mycelium, but there are parasitic molds and fungi that infect other fungi. So one common example of this would be the lobster mushroom. Hypomyces lactiflorum is actually a parasitic mold that infects a kind of boring white mushroom called, it can infect a handful, but the main one is Rustula in the Brevipes group. And it turns this mushroom into this gourmet, edible, kind of totally different, bright orange looking mushroom. And so there are other parasites that get in and can affect them, whether it's turning it into a different sort of mushroom or attacking the actual mycelium. I don't recall that the study actually went into it, but the article that everyone references when discussing this says there was a slight preference to the picked mushrooms.
Interesting. So now that you mentioned lobster mushrooms, let's kind of go into that a little bit. And you actually, made the perfect segue there. So is there, because I hear a lot of different things, and I don't know if it modifies it once the other fungus infects the fungus and changes it, but like, is there any poisonous lobster mushrooms that we know of? And like, are the species before they're infected possibly toxic, if you will, or poisonous?
So my understanding is that, and I don't know about other states, specifically in the Southwest, in the Southern Rockies and kind of Southwestern states, the lobster mushrooms almost always infect Rustula brevipes group mushrooms, which are just sort of a boring looking white mushroom in the Rustula or the brittlegill genus. They can also infect milk caps in the Lactarius genus, but they almost always infect those Rustula. I have heard tell of toxic ones being infected by the lobster mold, which is Hypomyces lactiflorum, but I've never heard any documented case of somebody eating a lobster that was a toxic species and getting sick. I think my understanding is that the Hypomyces, there are multiple Hypomyces species, and Hypomyces lactiflorum, the lobster mushrooms, is kind of specializes in those rustula and milkcap mushrooms. There are hypomyces that target amanita mushrooms. There are hypomyces that target bolete mushrooms, so on and so forth. There's even other hypomyces that target other milkcaps and other lactarius. But the lobster specifically, as far as my understanding goes, is always safe to eat.
Awesome. And where do you typically find those? Is it like in a conifer type environment, or is it?
It depends where the habitats to find lobster mushrooms kind of depends on the state you're in. In the Southwest, they typically are found in ponderosa pine forests because their host species, the Rustula brevipes, like growing in ponderosa pine here. In other states, they grow with different trees, though. And I'm not super familiar with them. I haven't hunted them in any other states, but I do know in some, like in the Midwest, they're often found in deciduous forests, I think.
Interesting.
So, yeah, I know it can be different, and it really just depends on where their host species grows.
So if you were going to, and this is perfect because if you were going to scout, say you were going to the Midwest and you were going to scout, would you e-scout for them, or would you just kind of go and look for something?
Yeah, so I would research what sort of trees they're typically found in, or what sort of forest types they're found in, whether it's oak or pine, or and then I would figure out an area that has those sorts of trees, whether that's reaching out to local people that have information, or getting on a satellite and just sort of picking out where I can kind of see like deciduous versus conifer. I know at least in Minnesota, like the conifers are typically northern and the deciduous are more like central and southern. So
interesting.
Yeah, you can definitely e-scout for mushrooms, though. I do it regularly,
and that's
maybe not for lobsters.
I was going to get at that. Can you talk about e-scouting for mushrooms and how you approach that, and kind of just like key features that you're honing in on that you're looking for? And I know that varies per species, but
sure, yeah. In flatter states and states with predominantly deciduous forests, I don't know how well you can pick out like an oak forest from a maple forest on a satellite map. But I haven't done it. Yeah.
Unless you look in the fall, right? You'd have to probably, and this is just something that popped in my head, but you could go and find a piece that you're thinking of and looking at. Then you could go into Google Earth Pro and take the slider and slide it back to the time of year where the leaves would change, where it would depict actually what species, and you could kind of go from that. So you would know if it was a maple forest because the leaves are going bright versus, like an oak, which kind of turns brown. So one way to look at it.
That could work. That'd be a hot tip for finding oak forests. In Colorado and in mountainous states, you can get on and you can find elevations which matter for mushrooms. You can find different tree densities. You can find different aspects, which is the cardinal direction a slope is facing. So generally, for mushrooms in mountainous states, I'm going to start on a north-facing slope because those hold the most moisture. And then depending on the species, I'll look for different things. So we'll just talk for as an example about king boletes, porcinis. In Colorado, they grow in association with spruce and fir, but their preference is spruce. And they like to grow on edges of meadows or old logging roads, kind of areas of disturbance, clearings and forests. And so you can sort of pick that stuff out on a map. And based on elevation, you could assume that the forest is probably spruce fir, because we don't have to get into all the details, but forest type changes throughout the elevation bands in the mountains up to tree line. And then you can find meadows with the right sort of aspects or features that you want to look for, that mushrooms might fruit from, and then pick a few of those areas. And then when you get out there, you can sort of be like, okay, that one's not quite right. That's mostly pine, but this one over here is spruce. So let's start looking there.
Can you actually break down the elevation bands? Because I think that's something that would not only correlate to mushrooms, but it would also really tie into elk hunting as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, that's awesome.
So generally, and it can vary a little bit, but generally we have the plains, below the mountains. This is east of the mountains. We have the kind of foothills, which are predominantly scrub, mountain mahogany, sumac, ponderosa, juniper. That's from, say, 5,500 to 7,000 or so. 7,000 to 9,000 roughly is kind of a mixture of mid-elevation montane, which can include mixed conifers and aspens like Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, ponderosa, some of the spruces, and it can be mixed. You can have forests that are totally lodgepole pine. You can have forests that are totally ponderosa. But typically that kind of 7,000 to 8,000 or 7,000 to 9,000 band is often the most diverse when you're getting into montane habitats. Above that, starting around 9,000 or 9,500, you start getting into predominantly spruce fir and or lodgepole and some aspen in there as well. So the spruce fir are typically, just that spruce trees and fir trees. They kind of like the same conditions. They're typically darker, denser forests, wetter forests versus the lodgepole pine forest, which also can be higher elevation. A pure lodgepole forest is a drier habitat, often very little underbrush. If it was beetle killed, there's often a lot of down and deadfall to climb over. That's the same in spruce fir, though. There's just a lot of deadfall in Colorado if we're referencing elk hunting. And those habitats go to tree line, which is roughly 12,000 feet. And then above that, you have alpine. And, if you're doing early archery stuff, you might be getting into alpine for some of it, especially if you're doing mule deer. Mule deer are still up in alpine at that point. So, yeah, that's a very rough generalization of it, but that's kind of the breakdown.
No, I like it. So then let's talk about so you're honing in and you're looking for these north-facing slopes, these meadows, with transitional lines of different types of trees, right? And typically, what kind of trees are you looking for if you're looking for a king bolete?
So king boletes, I'm focusing on the spruce trees because that's their favorite host. And you can actually sometimes pick out a spruce fir forest versus a lodgepole pine forest on satellite maps. Their coloration's a little different and their density is usually a little different. It's not a perfect science, but you can sometimes pick those out. And so you want to find a mature spruce forest or a mature spruce fir forest with edges, essentially, is kind of the way I would describe ideal king bolete habitat.
When you say edges, you mean like the same type of edges where it's a transitional edge from one habitat into the next?
Yeah, and that would be specifically for king boletes, like meadows or an old logging road that it's created a disturbance in the forest where there's no trees, and so it gets some extra sunlight. There might be some young trees growing back in the old logging road. King boletes specifically prefer a little bit of sunlight in those kind of slightly disturbed areas.
Kind of sounds like you're describing prime elk habitat as well.
Yeah.
I mean, is that fair to say that you've scouted some spots for mushrooms and decided to look for elk there as well?
Yeah. Last weekend I was in a new spot picking mushrooms and teaching a class, and I saw probably more elk sign that I've seen in most spots that I hunt. So
were you dropping pins or do you have it memorized?
Oh, I got it memorized. Yeah.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, what kind of describe, because I saw something you posted the other day. So these king boletes are huge, right? I mean, they're like
they can be, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, like the boletes that we have, and I haven't picked any and actually eaten any yet because I'm a little bit scared and I need to educate myself more on the boletes. But kind of tell me about them, like the texture, the taste. I want to know a lot more about them.
So you've heard us referencing king boletes or porcini. That specifically is referring to a group of mushrooms in the Boletus edulis group, edulis meaning edible. Boletus edulis is thought to be a European-only species. There is some debate that we might have one that's very, very closely related here in North America, but it seems like that's still up in the air. But Boletus edulis is the type species for that group of similar mushrooms. In North America, we have about 15 species, and they're all, colloquially called porcini or king boletes. In Colorado, we have 2 species, the white king bolete and the ruby king bolete. And the one we've been talking about now is the ruby king bolete, which is Boletus rubriceps, which means redhead. It kind of has like a rusty brown or rusty red, really, really pretty cap color. And they can grow to be, I've seen some 15 plus inches across and several pounds, like 3-4 pounds, a single mushroom. By then they're typically a little wormy and squishy and no good for food. But the younger ones and kind of the medium-aged ones are great to use in all sorts of things. I pick the medium-sized ones for dehydrating. I like to have dried and powdered porcini around. It's a great kind of savory additive to any sort of dish, that mushroom powder. And then the dehydrated ones can be rehydrated and used in all sorts of things. The fresh ones, they're hard to describe. You have to have cooked them a couple times to get used to doing it correctly. They can be a little slimy if you don't cook them right. They have a lot of water, and so typically, if I'm going to saute them, like if I want like a mushroom burger or mushrooms and steak or something, I'll dry saute. So I'll slice them up, put them in a pan with nothing but a little bit of salt, and let the water kind of get sucked out of them and cook that off. And then I'll finish them with a little bit of fat and kind of crisp up the edges. That's the most basic way to cook them, but you can kind of cook them in endless ways any way you would cook a mushroom, the young ones at least. And the other thing that's interesting about them is so boletes in general have a pore layer or a tube layer. Instead of gills, they have a sponge. And the king boletes, as they mature, that sponge goes from white to yellow to a dark green color. And that sponge can actually be separated when it's mature and dried and used as sort of like an extra powerful mushroom powder, or you can cook it fresh. This isn't something I've experimented with a ton, but there's people that like to steam that and have compared it to like crab butter, that sort of like rich innards of crabs, just like complex flavor, but that same sort of texture. But yeah, my favorite are the young ones that are dense and nutty and mushroomy.
So there's kind of like a nutty taste to them.
Yeah, they have a little bit of a nuttiness. They're pretty mild mushroom. They're not super strong. A little bit of a dense texture, and they get really good if you get a little bit of like browning on the edges. The other day I sliced up some young ones and roasted them until they like were crisp on the outside but soft on the inside, and that was really good too.
You put them in the oven, and then yeah. So then what'd you put them on and eat them?
With that, I had them on some pesto pasta, which I made from our garden with the
Nice.
pesto. But yeah, I had elk burgers with mushrooms the other day, and
Nice.
elk
Man, you're
steaks
making
and
me hungry.
mushrooms. So yeah,
My mouth is
like
watering.
yeah, I like incorporating like all the wild foods as much as possible. So doing meals that are just fully foraged and hunted or fished and foraged is kind of a fun thing that I like to do every once in a while.
That's awesome. So I saw you doing something where you took and you made like a brine, and you brined the king boletes, or what were they? And you did something with them. What was the purpose of that versus just drying them?
Yeah, so I believe you're referencing the marinated mushrooms, which is a Hank Shaw recipe, and I'm sure your listeners are all familiar with Hank Shaw.
I hope. I don't know.
Yeah. If you're not, go look him up because he's awesome.
And Alan Burgo. You gotta.
Yeah, Alan Burgo is awesome as well. Hank Shaw's recipe. No, you're good. I was thinking I get to see Alan at the end of September at that event, so I was thinking about that. But the recipe for it's an Italian style marinated mushroom, and it's really just a way to preserve them that's not dehydrating or freezing. You slice them up and salt them really well, and the salt just sucks all the moisture out of them. And then that pulling that moisture out sort of condenses them a little bit, and they get a little more firm. And then you boil them. You take the salt, knock the salt off, and boil them in vinegar for 5 to 10 minutes. And then you dry them out to the point of kind of being still pliable but not wet anymore. And then you put those in a jar with oil and spices. Hank uses chili, lemon zest, and oregano. I used some dried cayenne chilies from our garden, and bee balm, which is a wild mint that is sort of an oregano-like flavor, and then lemon zest. And you cover that all in a nice high-end olive oil and just let it marinate for a week or more, and it lasts in the fridge for several months. Nice. And it's just like if you get a few pounds of like premium mushrooms, it's an amazing recipe to use them.
Have you tried that with any other mushrooms, or was that your first go around at it?
I've done it with chanterelles before, and it was really good. I think any sort of denser mushroom would do really well in it. I bet oysters would be fine.
Like a chicken of the woods, maybe?
I don't know if chicken of the woods, because chicken of the woods is kind of like,
it's not dense. You're right.
Yeah, it's not like it's kind of like almost fibrous to a way, like kind of, I guess it's chicken-like, but it might work. Yeah, it might work. I'm sure somebody's tried it. I haven't.
So hen of the woods probably would work, because
hen of the woods, yeah. I bet. And those two species don't really grow in Colorado. Chicken of the woods has been found, I think, 6 times in Colorado ever, all in kind of urban Front Range, low elevation, where they either came in on trees or where somebody's escaped cultivation, or just some random wild one. But I did get to pick my first chicken of the woods in Minnesota this summer.
How about a hen of the woods? Have you ever picked one of those?
I haven't. I'm hoping to in September.
You're the second person I've talked to that's never picked them, and I'm like, man, there's so many around here, and I've picked like 5-10 pounders before, big, and I'm like, well, I'm done. I don't need any more. So you might have to come down and pick a few for me.
I would love to. That's like top of my list. I'm taking a week off for the Midwest Wild Harvest Festival, which is a foraging festival put on in Wisconsin by Sam and Melissa Thayer. Sam Thayer is a well-known foraging author. And I'm going out there this year to teach mushroom classes for them. And I'm going to take a week and travel, see some friends in Nebraska and some friends in Iowa, and do some mushrooming on the way. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that I can.
I find them in August.
Hen of the woods finally.
So hopefully,
what's that?
I said sometimes like real late August you can even find them.
Okay,
but it has to be kind of like cooler temps.
Yeah, I know they fruit later and kind of even into fall. So I'm hoping end of September.
And I've even found them in November.
Wow.
Deer hunting. So like we had real mild weather. It got cold early and then warmed back up and just kind of stayed mild. And I think I found them like all the way into like the first week, maybe second week in November. So that was really cool. Even though I didn't take home a deer, I took home like I think 5 or 6 of them, and I sent my buddy home with 2 of them. I bet you it was, a total of like 20, 25 pounds of mushrooms. So it's pretty cool.
Heck yeah. Yeah. That's my big hope for the trip, and we'll see.
What's weird is like I found chanterelles growing in the same spots. Like chanterelles and like the hen of the woods seem to kind of like the same habitat, or at least in the Midwest where I'm at. So,
well, hen of the woods like oak trees, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that true for chanterelles as well?
Yeah, I found them in the oak area. So and it's not like all oaks though. So like if you get your pin oaks and stuff like that, you don't tend to find them. It seems to be your old growth oaks, mostly black oaks.
Okay.
Or at least around me. But
yeah. Cool.
But hey, good. I don't know what it is further north, but
that's a whole different world.
Yeah. Especially like
conifer forests of Colorado.
Way north, like the Northwoods of Wisconsin up there, But so you did something with your salt too. I got to get back to that food because it really kind of like got my gears turned. And that's in what is that in like Hank Shaw's book? I don't remember ever reading that.
The recipe is on his website. If you just look
Okay.
up Hank Shaw marinated mushrooms, and the salt is not something that he includes in his recipe, but what I did was, the salt that you cover the mushrooms in is it just pulls all the liquid out, and so it's just like a soupy mess of salt and mushroom water. And I drained off the water and dehydrated the salt. And so I'm saving the salt for another use because it's fine. It's salt. Right. It doesn't go bad. It loses a little pH when you get water in it and stuff, but it's still totally fine. And it also has like a little hint of essence of porcini now. So I have like this sort of sea salt that smells a little bit like porcini mushrooms.
So what are your plans for it then? Just use it as need be, or do you have actual recipes in mind?
So one thought was kind of layering that porcini flavor and adding some dried porcini powder to the porcini essence salt. So then you kind of get like a, layering of that same flavor. I do a lot of fermenting and pickling of things. And so I could sort of use that to see if I can impart a little bit of that porcini essence into there. It was just more so an experiment in that I didn't want to toss like a pound of salt out.
Right. Yeah.
So but I might as well dehydrate it and see what happens.
It's cool if you've got something you're actually gonna, use it for, or you have something in mind too. But so you mentioned though that you turn the mushrooms into powder. I think that's cool, but you're gonna have to break that down a little more. So you fully dehydrate them to the point to where they're, pretty much toasty.
Cracker crisp dry.
Okay.
And that's sort of any mushroom that is middling mature or, a little bit more mature, I'll dehydrate and I'll eat the younger ones fresh, or I'll cook them and freeze them. And that's just my personal preference. There's no reason for it aside from it's just what I like to do, because I like to have a lot of dehydrated mushrooms because they can keep essentially forever as long as you keep them dry. So if you want to make mushroom powder, you just take those dehydrated mushrooms and run them through either a mortar and pestle or a spice grinder or a blender, food processor, whatever you have to break down something into powder. And it makes a really cool spice. You can add it to eggs and you get like this complex, mushroomy, savory, depth that you wouldn't get really with anything else. It's, I guess maybe MSG kind of adds that like umami and depth of flavor and savoriness. It's a complex flavor that you can't really get anywhere.
So I don't know. It's got my wheels turning so much here, but so when you dry mushrooms to like reconstitute them and use them in something else, what temp are you drying them at? Because I've done it a couple ways. And I can never get them to where they stay like in their form. And I've seen some people where they dry morels and they dry them and they still look like a morel. Mine shrivel up. And is that like because I'm doing too much heat to them or something and it's actually cooking them? Or
no, they'll shrivel up. The only way to dry mushrooms and to sort of keep somewhat of their shape that I've seen is to freeze dry them. And you need an expensive freeze dryer if you're going to do that.
Yeah.
Which would be a cool tool to have.
Awesome tool to have. I'm still trying to convince my wife to buy one because, in fact, right now in my dehydrator, I've got some meals that I'm making for elk season right now. And it'd be awesome to have a freeze dryer instead of a dehydrator.
Totally. Yeah. I know some people that have them and use them for mushrooms a lot. But yeah, I just have one of those big like Excalibur dehydrators with all the trays. And I just run it on its lowest setting. And it's usually about 24 hours to go from 1/4 inch slices to cracker crispy dry. In Colorado, we don't have to have a dehydrator. We can just use a screen by a sunny window or a fan because it's not very humid here.
Yeah.
In some states, that's not super reliable. The humidity will just mold stuff. But yeah, here you can just sort of put them out on a screen and they'll dry out in like 3 or so days.
Yeah.
Or you can use the oven on its lowest setting.
I think we're at like 98% humidity here right now, so that's
it wouldn't work. That wouldn't work out.
Too good. It'll just turn to a goo. But so you do that, and like, how do you what do you use to rehydrate them? Because I've done a couple different ways. I've used like broth and things like that, and then I've actually rehydrated them in wine before, and then cooked with them that way, which was kind of interesting. It took on a whole new depth of flavor for sure.
Yeah, you can do really any flavor you want. If I'm just wanting mushrooms to use, in something as mushrooms, I'll rehydrate them in hot water. Just pour like boiling water over them and let them sit for an hour or so. You get the rehydrated mushrooms and you get a mushroom broth that way. But if you want to make, like a mushroom sauce and you're going to use broth as part of the sauce, you could rehydrate them in the broth and use the amount that you're going to use for the sauce, and then you can just sort of incorporate it all at the same time. Like you mentioned, wine. I know people who have rehydrated mushrooms and certain species of mushrooms in like a liqueur and then candied them, so they sort of like suck up that liqueur and then they become like sweet liquory mushrooms. It's kind of an endless, like, so many different ways you can do it.
So what's I gotta ask you, what's like the most obscure mushroom you've ever found?
The most obscure mushroom I've found. There are a couple species, non-edible species, that I've found that were either I couldn't identify, like I just couldn't figure out what they were. One of those was, I got it to the genus Suillus, which is the slippery jacks, but I never got a species on it. And there's some reasons for that. And another one I found was just like a fairly rare ground-dwelling polypore, which polypores are typically on wood, but there are a handful of species that fruit from the soil. And I found one of those that I had never seen before, and I had to kind of dig to figure out what it was. Neither edible, but kind of cool finds. The cool thing about mycology and mushrooms is that we learn more, like, regularly, and certain specific conditions can fruit a species that has been living in the soil for decades or even longer. Yeah. And it's just like, oh, okay, now it's my time to fruit. And you're like, wow, we had no idea that this was here. And some sort of conditions aligned for it, and there they are, and now we have to study them and figure out what they are and why they're here. So it's pretty interesting.
That's kind of been like this year. I've seen more different species, a lot of them that I haven't even had time to look at, or some of them I've taken pictures of, but it's been a really wet summer, which is pretty rare around here. Normally by this time, water levels are pretty low and things like that, and it's kind of different. So it's interesting to see all the different stuff kind of popping up that normally I don't see. And so like the one that I sent you, even though that's probably fairly common, but I've never seen it just kind of in the middle of the trail where I found it. And then I found another one. It looks super weird. So it's almost like a pheasant back.
Okay.
But underneath, it's got like little hedgehog looking. I don't know. It's not like a polypore or anything. Yeah, it's got like teeth on the bottom of it. Mm-hmm. But it looks almost like a pheasant back, and I cannot figure out what the heck that is.
Would be a sarcodon of some sort.
And it was, I don't know. That's a good start to maybe look to try and identify it. But
I'm almost, just based on your description, I'm almost positive it's a sarcodon species. We have one in Colorado, Sarcodon imbricatus. We have several, but that one is one of my favorite edible mushrooms.
Really? And I've never ever seen it before around here. So it's kind of interesting that popped up. But I'll have to look at that. But so any kind of big plans this year other than like doing the foraging thing? You got any hunts planned or anything like that?
Yeah, we've mostly focused on mushrooms, so maybe we'll have to plan another one to talk about plants one of these days.
Oh, geez.
Because
Yeah, that's an
I do that
entire,
too.
yeah.
Um, but hunts, yeah, I'm last year was a heavy hunt year. I got an elk with my bow, my first ever. I got 2 mule deer and a pronghorn buck, rifle hunts there. This year I'm sort of taking it easy. I'm doing some foraging stuff with some of my free time instead of hunting. But I have a late rifle mule deer buck tag, and it's the latest that the season has ever been in Colorado. So we'll be hunting like peak rut, which should be pretty fun. And then I'm doing a week in North Dakota for waterfowl and pheasant with one of my buddies who lives up there. So we'll be see what the weather does and chase whatever's around.
You going to be doing any exciting Hank Shaw recipes with the waterfowl or what?
Probably, yeah, probably will. I think I've been brainstorming on like what I can prepare to be ready for that trip. You know, like bring up some frozen mushrooms and make like a risotto that I can top with like a mallard breast or something. Or
have you cured any duck yet or no?
I haven't.
That's one thing I've always wanted to do too, is make like a duck pastrami or something. And I never.
Yeah, we have done goose pastrami before, and that's really good. But I haven't done duck before.
Interesting. That's something my problem is I end up hunting deer so long that it ends up going through, waterfowl season, and then it's too late. By the time it's all said and done, it's waterfowl season is over with, or they've already migrated through, and then I'm left with nothing. But
it lines up nice with my hunting season, because late October, when I'm going to be in North Dakota, is kind of early rifle seasons, which I don't typically hunt.
Yeah.
So I can kind of do that and then come back and do my later rifle season when I have a tag for that. Or if I'm doing archery, it's September, so well before.
Yeah. And our rut here for the whitetail is it's like November, the early November, so late October. So that kind of ruins it. But priorities, right? You do one or the other, and
for sure.
Maybe one day you'll have enough time to do them all.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Yeah. So we didn't even get to cover any plants or anything, but
it's too much to talk about.
Maybe next time for sure.
Yeah.
So before we go, can you tell everybody like where they can find you and all that kind of cool stuff?
Yeah. So I've got a website, Forage Colorado, foragecolorado.com. I am very active on Instagram, same Forage Colorado. I have a Facebook page, also Forage Colorado. And then just recently started doing the whole TikTok thing, doing some more video content. I've always enjoyed making video content, and in the past I did some YouTube videos, and I might get more into that in the future. But if people are on TikTok, it's my name, ORION AON, because I plan on incorporating some of the hunting and fishing and other wild food stuff aside from just the foraging in Colorado. So that's why that one's different.
Technically, hunting is foraging. I mean, you're actively seeking food, right? So
it is. It sure is. Yeah. I just don't share too much of it on the Forage Colorado specifically for several reasons, but mainly just audience sensitivity and not wanting to cross my wires too much. And
gotcha.
Hunting and foraging and mushrooms and fishing, and it's
also fun.
Yeah, I love all that stuff. I'm super passionate about all of it, but my brand Forage Colorado is specifically centered around just the plants and mushrooms mostly, and so I try not to dip into too much of the other stuff aside from when I'm cooking. And then I'll like, here's elk with wild mushrooms and wild plants that I foraged, and then they sort of get to see it that way at least.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think it's cool that you're doing that and educating others. I think it's super important, right? To not only better ourselves and learn as much as we can, but be able to not only learn it, but learn it well enough that we can pass it on to others is an amazing thing to do. And it's always interesting talking to people that can do that. And, that's why I started this podcast, so I can do that and hopefully not only educate myself, but educate others. And I think that's really cool. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for sharing. And it was great talking to you.
Yeah, great to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And once again, thank you so much for listening to the Publicly Challenged podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please subscribe on whatever platform it is you're listening to. Also, if you could leave a review, that would help us out. And you can check us out on Instagram or at publiclychallenged.com. And once again, thank you so much for listening to the show.